Welcome to When We Die Talks. I'm your host, Zach Ansell. In this podcast, we explore different beliefs about what happens when we die and how those ideas shape the way we live. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by The Dead Book. Okay, let's get real for a second. How prepared are your parents, your siblings, your partner, or even you for the future? We're not talking about the fun stuff, but the hard stuff. End-of-life planning. It's a tough conversation, but that's why The Dead Book exists. The Dead Book makes it easy to plan ahead, even if you think you don't have the time, money, or assets. It's affordable, straightforward, and designed to give you and your loved ones peace of mind. They've made it their mission to help others avoid the chaos and stress that comes with being unprepared. Visit thedeadbook.co and get started today. And just for listening, use the code WWDT at checkout for 15% off. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into this companion episode, or what I think I'm going to be calling a reflection episode, to the interview with Don Sayers that was released last week. So if you haven't had a chance to listen, you should go back and check that out first. Like I mentioned in the intro to that episode, I'm going to be trying out these little reflection episodes as a way to interject myself and my anxiety around death into the project a little bit more. I'll be looking back at things that stood out to me, things I wish I had asked more about, and sometimes questions the guests posted to me. Ultimately, I'm doing this, people. I don't necessarily need to publicly dissect my anxiety and these episodes. So in the end, if they don't resonate with you, let me know. If there's things that I could change, let me know. And ultimately, if they just don't work, then we'll get rid of them and just go back to the old format of an interview every week. But I'm going to at least try to do this for the next couple episodes that have already been recorded, and we can figure out where to go there. Last episode, I forgot to mention that in order to do the interview with Don, just because of his ALS, we needed to do the interview at his house. And so that means the podcast has officially gone on the road. And that was a challenge in some ways. Nailing down the audio has been thing for me from the start. Is when I listen to other podcasts, I get really annoyed when you have really good audio on one end, really bad audio on the other, or just crummy audio quality in general. And so it was a little bit of a challenge working remotely. So hopefully it didn't sound bad. I don't know. I think it worked out. There was about a 45-minute period where I was freaking out a little bit because there was someone doing some yard work outside, and I wasn't sure how noticeable that was going to be. So hopefully it wasn't. And just the setup that we did in order to get the microphone close enough to Don. I didn't have big microphone stands, so we were using his library collection to prop the microphones up with books and trying to get it as close as we could to him so that he could be comfortable throughout the interview. But I think it turned out really well, and I'm just really thankful that Don welcomed me into his home, and his wife, Donna. It was an interview that I was looking forward to doing from the point that I was first introduced to Don. And I even talked about it a little bit at the beginning, and this is actually probably a pretty good segue into one of the things that I took away from it, and maybe not the best way, but I got introduced to Don through someone in the photo video industry and ended up meeting up with him for coffee and just chatting. And I think we ended up talking for about 2 hours, at which point I think we both agreed it would be good to do or have him on the podcast. And then that was probably around September, I'm going to say probably September 10th, September 11th, because we scheduled the interview for the following week. And on the 13th, that's when I fell and had my accident and ended up tearing my retina and detaching my retina. Not super ideal, especially as a photographer. And so then we had to push the interview. I ended up having surgery the day that we were supposed to have the interview. And then I was in recovery mode. And then Don went on vacation. So we didn't end up doing the interview until November. And so I was just finally glad to get that done. And I'm really excited to see it's been the best released podcast episode so far. It's got a lot of traction, and I'm just super excited about it because I think Don is just an amazing human. And through our conversations, I don't know if there's any other way to say, just a great human. And he's definitely been pushing me to look at this project in different ways than I had thought. And we'll get into that a little bit towards the end of this. But so I'm glad that you were all able to meet him and hear his story. I think it's super profound and super impactful. I have a ton of gratitude. I think there's definitely days over this past year where things have felt like they're falling apart, like my eye surgery, and you think, man, this is the worst. My life is so tough. And you get perspective on someone else and what's going on with them. I think, and not trying to call anybody out or anything like that, but I'm guilty of it as well. As there's sometimes where life sucks, life's so hard and this and that. And then you have a conversation with someone like Don, who is going through something so difficult and so hard. And then he had that line at the end that was like, life is worth living. And he has to show that to his grandkids, even though there's a lot of days that are really hard. And I think that's a lesson or a message for us all to hear, that life is hard. Life can be really difficult and complicated and all these things. But there's always things to be grateful for. And we just need to look for that. I don't know. That's a little bit of what I took away from that. And that's not even necessarily something that I had written down to mention. But yeah, kind of getting back to my eye surgery, and that kind of plays into a little bit around one of the first things that came up for me, and maybe not the best way, but talking to Dawn, and then also at the same time dealing with my eye surgery. I had my eye surgery 4 or 5 months ago now, and just this past week finally got cleared by the doctor to get a new prescription so I can see normally or relatively normally again. And I went in and got my eye checked out, and the new glasses will help with that. But I still felt, and maybe I'll feel differently when they get here, but it still felt like there was something a little off. And that got me thinking about the fear of aging and dying and having this injury to my eye that might not ever get back to the way that my eye was. And not that I've had great eyes, but it's very disorienting when your vision is funky out of one eye. And yeah, I think I spiraled out a little bit at some point this week thinking about this could be the best that my eyesight is for the rest of my life, and that could get worse. And so you go down a little bit of a rabbit hole there. And so I think I'm finally starting to see a little bit of the aspects of the fear of dying or the fear of aging. I've never really agreed with the idea of that I'm young, I feel invincible. I've never felt invincible. I think I've always been afraid of death, and I've never really resonated with that, but I get it in this way of, oh yeah, my body's going to hold up and my eyes and all these things. But as you start to age and start to see those things, it is a little startling. And yeah, I think in this rabbit hole started to think about how this eye injury will impact the rest of my life. Will it get worse? There's always a possibility that just because I already have, that I'll tear it again, or there'll be another injury, or I'll have to have another surgery. And so it brought that up in a way that wasn't necessarily ideal, but I think it's practical and something that I do need to think more about in this process of working through my anxiety. Is part of it is that we all do get older, and our bodies start to fail and fall apart in ways and not heal the way that they used to. And accepting that is as much a part of this process as accepting that we are going to die and all these other things that we're talking about. But yeah, so I think that was one of the ones that stood out to me. Don was talking about how even up till the point of his diagnosis, he was hiking a ton, climbing mountains. He had been a runner his whole life. He had been very active. And a lot of those things check boxes for me. I'm not necessarily like a distance runner, being a sprinter through college and then continuing to be active post-college and all that stuff. It hit home, and it made me realize that no matter what, you could do all the right things. You could take the right vitamins. You could eat the perfect diet. You could do all these things that the world's telling us to do to be healthy humans, but death will still find us. Illness will still find us, and we need to accept that. There's no immortality. Anyway, so I think I dragged on with that one a little bit long, but that was one that I left thinking a little bit more about and realizing that's maybe a part of this process that I need to tackle a little bit more. One of the most exciting things, I think, sometimes it's hard because I'm already working on the next episodes. So I don't know if it's in an upcoming episode or if I've already said it. But I like the idea of this project being a way for me to like cherry pick ideas. And one thing that I really love that Don talked about in the Baha'i faith was the idea around that this world that we're living in is the womb of the spiritual world. And so I found a quote. I'll link it or I'll share it in the show notes. I don't necessarily know how to pronounce this person's name, but it's someone of the Baha'i faith. And they say, to consider that after the death of the body, the spirit perishes is like imagining that a bird in a cage will be destroyed if the cage is broken. Though the bird has nothing to fear from the destruction of the cage. Our body is like the cage, and the spirit is like the bird. If the cage becomes broken, the bird will continue and exist. Its feeling will even be more powerful, its perceptions greater, and its happiness increased. And this is the one thing that I left our conversation really curious and interested in a way of making me think about the world differently than I had before. I would not consider myself a religious person. Don, we've met up since our interview and have kept conversations going, and I'm loving learning about the Baha'i faith through him and just what that means. But there was just something about this analogy that really stood out to me because it was just a way for me to think of things in a different way that, okay, we came into this world from our mothers, and that was this process that we weren't cognizant of. This world that we're in now was aware of us, like Don talked about, that he could push on his wife's stomach, and his children weren't necessarily aware that their father was doing that. And so, yeah, it got me thinking about this idea of us being in this world, not necessarily as like a test of be a good person, do these things, but in a way of growing to be the best people that we can be, learning about ourselves, challenging our ideals and our ideas and our beliefs. And I think that is a lot of what I took from Don too in our conversations is he, I think throughout his life has challenged what he believes, what he thinks, and has sought out conversations to challenge how he views the world. And so I think that's something that I'm going to dive more into on my own of if this is the womb of the spiritual world, then what does that mean for the next level? Are we just going through layers of layers? Was the next world or dimension or whatever we want to call it, the womb of whatever? But yeah, I really enjoyed that. I loved the analogies that he brought up from the Baha'i faith. I thought it was a really good way to understand the religion succinctly and not have it be these really complex thoughts that went over your head or anything like that. I thought it was delivered in a really, really good way. One of the other things that I really enjoyed, I think it was towards the end of the episode where he was talking about how a lot of people have, or maybe not a lot of people, but he has people who are willing to ask him anything. And one of the questions that he said he got asked was, how does it feel to be dying? And I love this question in a similar way to the sign off to the podcast of have a good life. How does it feel to be dying? That's a question that we can all ask anybody and ourselves. We are all dying. And so how does it feel to be dying? And I think that can be answered in a million different ways. Oh, it could be the suffering that's going on in your life. It could also be the happiness and all this stuff. It just feels like a more clever way of saying, how's it going? How are you doing? The questions that we get asked and ask people every day and have these robotic responses of, I'm good, doing all right, what's up, how's it going? I don't know, I just love the idea of switching it up maybe and getting people off that cadence and that rhythm by asking, how does it feel to be dying? How does it feel to be dying? One of the things that I really wish I would have been able to ask more about or have more time to hear about, at the point that he brought this up, we had been talking for probably about an hour and 45 minutes. And I think from my perspective, he definitely was not necessarily over it. I think he was very much enjoying it, but I think he was just tired. I think it took a lot out of him. And it was when I asked that final question about what would you want your family to know if you died tomorrow? And then he told the story about his sister and his nephew dying in the car crash. And that was just, that hadn't come up in our previous conversations or text exchanges or anything like that. And Not that I expected him to tell me that or anything like that, but it was very shocking to hear that story come up out of the blue and then feel like we didn't have the ability to dive into it, and maybe there wasn't really anything else to dive into there. But I don't know. I think that's the one thing looking back on the interview and the episode, as I listened back to it, was I'd love to know more about that story, because that's a huge traumatic event that happened to him and his family. Yeah, and I don't know. I think we could have had an interesting conversation off that. And to be completely honest, I'm supposed to see Don in the next couple of weeks. And so I wouldn't be shocked if we end up talking about it at some point. Those were the big things that stood out to me. But Don did swing for the fences, and I reached out to him and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing these little reflection episodes. I want to dive in to the episode a little bit, give my experience a little bit more, and maybe you could send me a question that you'd want me to answer, since I got to spend 2 hours asking you questions. And he sent a couple all in the same vein. And to be completely honest, I've read the question. I haven't written anything down. I haven't really thought about it too hard, because I wanted this to be more an off-the-cuff response. And so I'm just going to read it verbatim that he sent it to me. The first question I would ask is, what criteria are you looking for evidence or proof of life after death? Or stated a different way, why do you think there is evidence for proof of life after death? And then followed up with, if there is life after death, is that proof of God? Or does one have to believe in God to believe in life after death? Ultimate question, does God exist? And I just love this kind of string of questions, because I was expecting, I don't know, something smaller, but I should never expect anything like that out of Don, who just loves intellectual conversation. Going back to the first question, and I don't want to take too long on this, but I'll try to answer all these if I can. I don't necessarily know the criteria that I'm looking for, but ultimately I'm just looking for something that feels right. And right now, with me being a fairly analytical mind, I look at things and say, how can anything go on after this? If brain function ceases and the heart stops and you stop breathing and all this stuff, isn't that what's firing the machine? But yeah, I also think that there's part of me that does believe that there is something more, that consciousness is a very interesting thing that is almost impossible to explain. I think some people would say it's just the brain firing in a way. I think it's one that I have a little bit of a harder time trying to wrap my brain around. And so I don't necessarily think that there's something like, oh yeah, if I'm not looking for God to speak directly to me or this or that, or there's not something specific that I can say, oh yeah, if this happened, then I would know. I think it's more, I would know because this happened. I think it's just experiencing things. And that's part of this project, is opening my mind to the possibility of other things. That's happening with my meditation practice. After Ryan's episode, I've been diving into Buddhism a little bit. After Don's episode, I've been researching Baha'i a little bit. And so through all of this research and stuff like that, it's just opening up my mind to the possibilities. And I think that's a little bit of what Don did before he was like, yeah, Baha'i is the faith that I believe in. He was searching for answers and he found what he needed. I haven't found that yet, might not ever find it, but that is legitimately what this project is about. I think that kind of answers the first part of his question. If there is life after death, is that proof of a God, or does one have to believe in God to believe in life after death? For me, I think God is a term in my mind that kind of makes me think of this all-knowing being who created this and blah, 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 blah. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that there needs to be a God for there to be life after death, because that just makes me think, God makes me think of there's an architect who created and thought out this whole thing, which that's just one that I can't wrap my brain around. It doesn't really resonate with me. But I do think that it is possible for there to be life after death and there not be this architect. If there is like an architect, I'm more on the lines of a simulation model versus an all-knowing being. I don't know. And so ending with the question, does God exist? I think where I stand right now, I would say no. Again, the word God to me feels like this architect, this all-knowing being, and it just doesn't make sense to me. But going back to the last question, I'm not saying that doesn't also mean that I don't think that there's something else that happens after this. I'm still open to that idea. I'm still open to that concept, but I don't think believing in life after death means that I also have to believe in a God. I think this was an interesting way to go back and review the episode. Let me know what you think. I am curious. I don't want this to just be me rambling for, I don't know what this will end up being, probably about 20, 25 minutes. I don't want to create episodes of me just rambling, talking. Like I talked at the front, I don't necessarily need to publicly process my thoughts and feelings around these conversations. I'm just hoping that it might help other people or it might spark conversations. So let me know if you liked it. Let me know if you don't. I'm also going to be editing this episode. I have had someone edit all the previous episodes, and so I'm going to try to work on my editing skills on these smaller episodes so that hopefully mid-year I can take over completely the editing. Let me know if it sounds worse or better or any of that stuff. But yeah, I hope this was enlightening in a way. I really hope you guys enjoyed the conversation with Don. Really excited for next week's episode. So yeah, thank you for tuning in, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of When We Die Talks. I hope today's conversation sparked some thoughts and helped you feel a little more at ease with the idea of death. Remember, this journey is all about exploring our beliefs and fears together, so I'd love to hear from you. Call our voicemail at 971-328-0864 and share what you think happens when we die. Your thoughts might just be featured on a future episode and could help others on their own journey. Until next time, have a good life.